Welcome back to the Base Talk podcast. I am your host, Jacob Billingsley, owner and founder of Base Sports Performance in Hernando, Mississippi. In today's episode, we're going to discuss how training works and why you should train as an athlete if you're looking to maximize your potential. What's going on? Welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the how and the why of training athletes. So the question I have here is, why do we train athletes? Why do athletes train? And when we have athletes come in for their initial evaluation, we will ask them what their main goals are. And a lot of times those athletes will come back with something along the lines of, I want to get stronger or I want to get faster. And those are obviously, two things that we're going to focus on, and those are great answers. But then a lot of times we will kind of dig a little bit deeper and try to figure out the why behind that, right? So why is it that you want to get faster, and how do you think that's going to help you, reach your goals or reach whatever it is that you're trying to do? And, most of the time they'll say, I want to get stronger, I want to get faster. And, they think that those things are going to help them, in baseball and softball, hit the ball harder or throw harder, or in volleyball and basketball, jump higher and things like that, which absolutely is the case. But we as coaches want to kind of help educate and set some expectations around, why is it that we even train in the first place, and how is that going to help you? So, the short answer to that is, why do we train them is, again, because we want to help them perform better at their sport. We want to help them perform at their highest level in their sport. So once the coach understands, what it is this athlete is looking to do and what sport they play, our job as coaches is to understand what is physically needed in those sports. So understand, what an athlete needs physically in order to, get better at that sport and in order to maximize their potential in that sport. So, once we understand what it is that they're looking to do and what it is that sport demands, the demands of that sport, then we as coaches create a program that is going to create adaptations to their body to help them with those things. So pretty much all that means is, when we find out, a basketball player wants to jump higher and change directions quicker and things like that, well, us as coaches, our job is to say, okay, what is it that's going to help this athlete jump higher and change directions quicker? And that's going to be vertical force production and lateral acceleration, lateral deceleration for change of direction, right? So small things like vertical force production is going to be, a squat variation or a deadlift variation, or, a weighted jump, or, things like that are going to help with vertical force production. And then lateral acceleration and deceleration, that's going to come from our change of direction drills and our warm-up, where we're doing shuffles and crossovers and, coach-directed shuffle drills and reaction drills and things like that. So once we understand what that athlete needs in their sport, then we will create a program that's going to help create those adaptations that the body needs in order for them to perform better at their sport. So that brings us to the next thing is, what is an adaptation, right? So there's this thing called the SAID principle, SAID, and all that stands for is specific adaptation to impose demand. Literally all that means is, the body will specifically adapt to the types of demands placed on it. So if we are training a basketball player or a volleyball player with the sole intent of vertical force production, well, assuming that they're an athlete that, needs to focus more on the strength spectrum, we are going to obviously place a lot of emphasis on pushing the floor away and, creating a really good movement pattern through a squat and a deadlift variation and a split squat and jumps and, sticking the landings on their jumps. And, in our warm up, we go through a bunch of hurdle variations where we are teaching their body to absorb the force once they hit the ground. We'll do that from jumps, which is 2 feet, as well as hops, which is 1 foot. And all we're doing is teaching the body to accept and produce force vertically, some of the variations, of course, are medial lateral, which will get them into the frontal plane. Some of them will actually do some rotational jumps, which is, technically transverse plane, things like that. But if we focus on that specific adaptation that we want, if we're solely focused on creating vertical force production, and we focus on, getting stronger through those types of exercises, the body is going to get better at that, right? So the body self-organizes and creates tissue around the areas that is going to need to increase that vertical force production. So again, depending on if the athlete needs strength or power or both, we as coaches are going to make those adjustments in the program. But long story short, the adaptation is what we are trying to get as coaches. We are creating a program that's going to create adaptations to the specific need of that athlete. So, another example of this is, let's use a not an athlete variation. So for individuals that sit for extended periods of time, their body will start to change structurally to adapt to the demands of sitting. So the imposed demand is sitting, right? We're sitting there, the body is is tilted forward, and if we're sitting for long periods of time and we're on our computer or reading or whatever it is, that's the demand that we need. So the body is going to adapt the body to get better at sitting, to get better at that demand. So just because an adaptation is potentially helpful, it's also, potentially not helpful, right? So it depends on what it is that we're trying to work on. Another example of this, of an adaptation, is like an overhead athlete, like a pitcher in baseball or softball, right? So, when you go to throw the baseball or softball, the arm has to go back into external rotation. And over time, the body gets used to that arm going back into external rotation and then coming into internal, as we go to throw. So what happens is the humerus in the arm, in the throwing arm, is going to actually, tilt backwards to help you get more external rotation over time, especially for younger athletes that are doing this as their body continues to grow. We're playing youth sports, youth baseball, youth softball, and we're used to throwing a ton. The body's going to help us with that. So the demand is the shoulder is going back into extreme external rotation in order to load the arm and throw the ball. The adaptation of the body is going to be to turn that humerus backwards in the joint to help you get more external rotation on that throw. So that is another example. So, in a third example would be something, let's just use a weight room example here. So a reverse sled drag. So what that is the sled's in front of you. You have some sort of rope or attachment around maybe your hips, and it's going in front of you and it's connecting to the sled. And you've got weight on the sled and you're walking backwards slowly. So a reverse sled drag like that is going to put more emphasis, obviously, on several muscles, but primarily the quads, right? The quadriceps. So as you're walking backwards and pushing the floor away, in a reverse sled drag, it's going to put more focus and more stress on the quads. So in turn, the body is going to adapt to gain strength and hypertrophy muscle mass in the quad area, right? So the said principle, again, is specific adaptation to imposed demand. The demand is, we're putting stress and focus on the quads in the reverse sled drag. The adaptation is we're going to gain strength and muscle mass in the quads. So those are just a couple examples of what is an adaptation and how does that help or hurt us, as athletes or just in general. Another really good point that I want to hit here is coaching the programs. So these programs are only as good as how well they are coached. So just because, one of our coaches or somebody else, online or whatever has written a program that's specifically for, your sport or whatever, a volleyball player. Let's just say it's an 8-week vertical jump program. Just because they've written that program for that does not mean that's how the body is going to adapt. And what I mean by that is the attention to detail of the movement for that athlete still matters. So, let's just say that in that program we had a squat variation that the focus was to, gain strength both eccentrically, isometrically, and concentrically through the movement. Again, that's just going through a normal squat, right? Let's say that that's the goal of it. But what if this athlete, has a very poor squat pattern, and they get to the bottom of their squat and their knees cave in and their chest caves down and forwards, and on the way up, their chest is kind of lagging and it's putting a little bit more emphasis on their low back, things like that. So the intent of that program was to help the body, get in a better position to produce vertical force. But if that exercise is not executed correctly by the coach, coaching that athlete, then the body's going to adapt negatively, right? So the body's going to, obviously there's going to be more stress on the medial, part of the knee joint when the knees cave in. And there's going to be a little bit more stress on the low back and the lumbar and, spinal erectors and things like that if the chest is lagging and it's a little bit lower, which again is not necessarily the adaptation we want in that program. So the point of that is, just because there's a program that's written for something does not mean that you're going to get the adaptation you need. It still needs to be coached properly, and it still needs to have attention to that detail of the movement. That's why our coaches, if you've come to one of our training programs, you obviously see we have a ton of coaches on the floor, right? And the reason for that is we hold our programs to a very high standard. We are making sure that the movement quality is first. If that movement quality is not first, everything beyond that is completely irrelevant, and it actually might potentially hurt. So, we need to learn the correct movement pattern that we want before we add load to that. And I think I hit this in an earlier episode. Pretty much, if you're loading weight on a movement that is not what we want, or it's not ideal, we are just getting stronger at doing a poor movement. That poor movement does not help you on the field or on the court. So that's the adaptation that we're creating, is an adaptation that we don't even want. We want to make sure that the movement quality is good and make sure that the execution of the exercise is good. And that is how you create the adaptations that you want in the program. So again, just because you find an 8-week velocity enhancement program online or whatever, those programs and the exercises and rep schemes, that might be similar to what, someone who's coaching, in a group environment or a private organization or something like that. It might be similar to the same program, but if it's not coached correctly, you're not going to get the outcome that you want. You're not going to get the adaptation that you want from that. So long story short, to wrap that one up, the programs that are written are only as good as how well they are coached. Again, let's flip this on the other side. So if an athlete, is wanting to push for more weight and the coach does not want them to, the coach is trying to bring them back, say, hey, look, let's keep the weight down. Let's increase how well we do the reps of this exercise before we increase the load. And that athlete is like, nah, I want to go up and weight. And they go up and weight. It still is on the athlete to make sure that the attention to that detail of the movement is good. So it's still on the athlete as well to not rush through the reps and not push too much weight or too little weight. And that's why we have coaches there, is to provide direction and guidance to those athletes on what and when they need to do things with these exercises. So again, just because, the program is written for that does not mean that you will get the desired outcome if the focus and the intent is not where it needs to be. And that's why we have such good coaching, and that's why we will always do that, and invest in our coaches and their education. So moving on to the last point is what you feed grows. So what I mean by that is the body's going to adapt. The body is going to adapt whether it is a good adaptation or a poor adaptation. So, I briefly hit this earlier, but, for individuals that sit for extended periods of time and they work on their computer or whatever, the body is going to self-organize and get better at the demand, get better at what it is that you're asking it to do. So if you're sitting for a long time, the body's going to naturally get better at sitting, right? If you are, in a really like extended posture where like, your ribs and your chest are kind of pointed up, but your hips are tilted forward and your butt's poking out, you're in this like extended posture, lumbar extended posture, and it's not really helping you with keeping anterior core strength and keeping your hips in a proper alignment and posteriorly tilted, to make sure that we're able to move efficiently through the torso. So just as an example that I've used before is, as rotational athletes, which is pretty much every sport, but let's just use baseball, for example, and use a pitcher. So a pitcher on the mound, when we go to rotate between our hips, our shoulders, our torso, if we're in this big extended posture, it's going to be really difficult to rotate efficiently, which is obviously going to keep us from, maximizing our potential with the ball velocity and the movement pattern on the mound. But if we can keep that stacked posture where our ribs and our chest come back down and our hips posteriorly tilt to create that, stacked posture between our ribs and our hips, that's where we're going to create more efficient rotation, which is going to help us on the mound, help us hitting, things like that with rotational stuff. Another just quick exercise, an example of this is like one of our arm care exercises. We do what's called a J-band Y. All that is, there's a band attached to your wrist. You're coming up into a one-arm Y. Instead of taking your hand directly overhead or directly out to the side, we're kind of at that 45 degrees right in the middle. And the focus of that exercise is that mid and low trap. So what we're trying to do is posteriorly tilt that shoulder blade backwards with this exercise. If we're going really fast and we're kind of shrugging up at the top of the exercise, we're probably using more like upper trap or deltoid or something like that. So just because the exercise is the correct exercise, if it's not executed correctly, we're not going to get the adaptation we want, which was that mid and lower trap to help that shoulder blade posteriorly tilt. If we use our upper trap and we shrug in that exercise, then the scap isn't going to posteriorly tilt as much as we want, and we're not going to get the adaptation we want from an arm care standpoint. So to wrap all of this up, the reason that we train is because we want to get better as athletes, right? We want to get better at our sport. We want to get better on the field. And the way that we train matters. The adaptations are going to be good or they're going to be bad. And that's going to depend on the level of execution of the exercises in the weight room, on the field, on the court, in the warm-up, everything. So your body is going to adapt whether you want it to or not. All right. And then, the last point that I want to hit, is those programs are only as good as they are coached, right? So they still need to be, there needs to be high attention to the detail. They need to be executed properly, and they need to be under the supervision of somebody, that understands what the goal is for that athlete, for their sport, and the demands that we need to place on it. So that's going to wrap up this episode of, how training works and why you should train as an athlete, to maximize your potential. Thanks for listening.